In this video, we're going to be replacing the CV axle shafts on the driver's side of this 2008 Acura MDX. All right, we're going to take our wheel off and use a 22mm socket. All right, we're going to remove our axle nut here. It's staked in. So we're just going to use a flathead screwdriver in this little channel, get in there and pry that out. A side note on this also, when you're doing this job, you do not want to reuse your old axle nut. If you're doing a CV or doing any kind of axle work, you should be replacing the axle nut. So now we're going to go ahead and take that off. With a 36mm socket on an impact, we're going to take this off. Now we're going to remove our ball joint from our knuckle. First thing we're going to do is take out this cotter pin. I'm going to use a pick tool. This cotter pin's a little bit different than other ones. I'm going to use a pick tool and open up that side, and a small pair of bent pliers, needle nose, and pull the cotter pin right out. That's what this one looks like. Now this castle nut here, it's going to be a 19mm. I'm going to use a wrench and just break that free. Now to separate our ball joint and our lower control arm from our knuckle, we really have no point of leverage, so what we're going to need to do is use a pickle fork here, a couple of hits. Alright, now that we have that ball joint separated, what we're going to do is pry it right out of the knuckle. We're going to use a pry bar. See if we can leverage it against the frame of the vehicle. Push that control arm and ball joint right out, like so. All right. All right, so at this point, you can see how our axle slid back into the splines on our hub or our knuckle. If it hasn't, I don't want to use a rubber mallet, push that backwards. Let's see if we have any more room. We're just going to push it back with our breaker bar. Ideally what you want to do at this point, push your axle back, pull your hub forward, separate the two. So we're going to grab a hold of our axle and our rotor, pull in opposite directions. Okay, so we're going to pull forward on our hub, pull our axle out of the knuckle, out of the hub assembly. Okay, so we just clear that of our knuckle. Now what we're going to do, you don't want to pull away from the motor on your axle. We're going to get in behind it and we're going to pry forward with a pry bar. All right, so at this point you want to put one hand or some support on your CV axle shaft while you are backing out the back side. You'll get to a point when all the support will be needed on one side and you can remove your axle. All right, so before we can install our new CV axle shaft, we're going to put a little bit of grease on our splines. You don't want grease in every single spline. You want a little bit of room for air to escape. What we're going to do here is just clean this surface the best we can, get rid of any grime or residue. It will stop two surfaces from seating flush. All right, so now we can take our new CV axle shaft and slide it into position. What we're going to need to do is keep one hand out here on the hub side with our other hand direct the back side onto the splines. You're going to want to line it up until they clock in and just push inward. All right. Now you still have, we have about an inch gap between the axle shaft and the housing. We're going to keep pushing in to close that gap. All right, so once you get your axle shaft fully seated and flush against the casing here, there's a lock ring you're going to have to push into place when you do that. Once you get that fully seated, now we can move forward to putting your axle into the knuckle. All right, so before we can put our axle into the knuckle, we have to take off our axle nut. All right, so we're going to put a little grease on our splines before we put it into our knuckle. All right, so also on the back side of your hub bearing assembly, you just want to put a little grease where your CV axle is going to meet up. We are going to put our CV axle into our hub bearing in the knuckle. We're going to do that. I'm going to try and move our hub and whole knuckle aside a little bit where we can direct our axle in place. You will have to bend your axle, kind of get it lined up. All right, now once you're at this point, try not to push forward. You will separate the axle internals on the back side. So once you are lined up and your splines are clocked and they do slide in, we're going to move our whole knuckle assembly to the axle. All right, the next step now, I'm going to be getting it back on our control arm ball joint. All right, we're going to use a pry bar, put some downward pressure on the control arm. Let's see if we can align our ball joint back into place. You need a lot of force to do this. Give us a little bit more action on this control arm. I'm going to loosen up this back bolt here. It's going to be a 22 millimeter. Just going to back it out a few threads and see if that gives us a little bit more room to move the control arm down. All right, so now that you can see we have a little bit easier time moving our control arm. With a pry bar, we're going to pull our control arm down and we're going to push our knuckle into place. Just going to use a dead blow mallet, just kind of seat our ball joint. All right, so now we can put our castle nut back on to our lower ball joint. Because of the location on that, we're going to need to use a wrench. It's a 19mm wrench. All right, so what we had to do was put a little pressure upwards on our control arm to lock up our ball joint from spinning. Now we can continue with that 19mm wrench. All right, now that we've got it snugged up, we can come back and torque it down. We can torque it down to 80 foot-pounds. All right, now because we loosened this up, we're going to go ahead and tighten that down to 119 foot-pounds. So now we're going to put our cotter pin back in place. Just going to press it in place, grab the top, and just pull it over. Just a little bit of engine oil on the back here where it meets up. And then go ahead and thread this on. Now we're going to torque down our spindle nut. We've got our wheel propped against the floor with a pry bar so we can stop the rotation. I'm going to go to 181 foot-pounds. Okay. Now that our spindle axle nut is seated and torqued into place, we can go ahead and punch in our lock here. I'm just going to use a punch or a drift pin. All right, once you've got your CV axle installed and everything's back together, you can check your transmission fluid. If you had any leak when you removed your CV axle the first time, you're going to want to refill to the fill line. Now's the time to go ahead and check that. So we're just going to not torque these, but just tighten them up, and we'll come back and torque them. All right, so now we can torque down our lug nuts. We're going to tighten them down to 94 foot-pounds. Again, we're going to use a 22mm socket for that. We're going to do them in a crisscross pattern.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.